Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. I am Udit Mishra with the Indian Express. The idea in this show is to sort of look back at what was triggering the farm distress and to understand whether the fact that now that these three farm laws have been repealed, will that resolve farm distress? Is that the end of the story? This week we caught up with Professor Himanshu. He is one of the most well-recognized voices on farm issues. He teaches at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Associate Professor for Economics, and he's also had one of the longest columns on farm issues.
One is that because we have opened up the economy to the global one, our domestic levels of protection are weaker. We reduced the tariff on various commodities, which we were not supposed to do, to a level which was basically opening the agricultural sector to a competition which was unfair competition. I mean, for example, we were self-sufficient in edible oil and pulses both. But in both cases, edible oil, for example, we allowed cheaper palm oil to come in, which kind of destroyed our own competitiveness of our own edible oil. We also withdrew the kind of protection that was available to various inputs and various subsidies that was given to the farmers to be competitive. And I must reiterate here that from a poorest country in this world, of the 200 countries which is there, to the richest country, agriculture is subsidized, is supported, is protected by the government. And the rule is very clear: the richer you are, the more protection you offer. But every country does it. India went into a path where we basically withdrew all the support that was there, that came from the 1991 economic reforms philosophy as such, that any subsidy is bad, any kind of protection is bad, let the market take care of it. But that is how it was so unfair, because the countries which were proposing these kind of things were themselves the biggest supporters of their agriculture. The biggest subsidy per farmer or per crop was given by these countries, and we were basically competing with our hands folded at the back.
By 2008-9, the farm distress had obviously ballooned, and the government had come out with a massive farm loan waiver. So did that not solve the problem?
It did. In the sense, the farm loan waiver, what they did was they basically led to a situation where farmers' balance sheet was clean. But during the same time, due to 2010 onwards, as you remember 2008 when the financial crisis happened, the government of India went into an overdive, giving fiscal stimulus to the manufacturing sector, to the corporate sector and various other things, which led to a deterioration of your fiscal balance. Your fiscal deficit went up. Now when your fiscal deficit went up, the knife fell on the farmers. I mean, how do you control it? And that is where farmers became the first enemy. When you tried to reduce subsidies on petroleum and other commodities, you try to reduce subsidies on fertilizers, and all of that done in a haphazard and ad hoc manner, which contributed more to the damage, not just to the farmers' income and farmers' profits, but also to the environment. I mean, fertilizer is a classic example of it, that in 2010 the government introduced the nutrient-based subsidy regime, which basically raised the prices for what we call as the complex fertilizers, or the P&K fertilizers, while keeping the urea prices constant. That created a distortion that led to all the prices of fertilizer going up. And for the first time, we had 4 or 5 years when fertilizer consumption went down because the prices were doubling, more than double. Fertilizer shortage was there, and there was riots related to fertilizer. People were being lathi charged. In many states that happened. I'm telling you again simply because the same story is repeated now.
But wasn't the nutrient-based subsidy regime basically there to improve the use of fertilizers, make them more balanced?
It was supposed to, but you come to a situation where you basically delink the prices of the urea versus the other complex fertilizers. The other fertilizers prices went up, and because the farmer is again a price-sensitive farmer, he ran towards buying urea. As a result of which, urea prices went up because there was completely, the unmanageable demand for urea. So as a result of that, simple basic economics will tell you that when there are commodities which are substitutes, and you raise the prices of one commodity, leaving the other commodities untouched, there is going to be shift of demand to that commodity. So we ran into a trouble, and as a result of it, all fertilizer prices went up. it changes the fertilizer complex mix. We had reached a recommended 4:2:1 NPK ratio to something like 10:2:1. I mean, that's the kind of worsening of the situation that we ran into. So environmentally it was bad, politically it was bad, and remember we are the biggest importers of fertilizers. In a sense, we import a large part of our fertilizer that we consume in our economy. We knew all of this. We also knew that at that point of time, petroleum prices were going up. They went up to $120 per barrel. And we know that fertilizer prices are linked to petroleum prices. So fertilizer prices in market will go up. And doing a reform at that point of time was a double tragedy that farmers had to face. So we had a situation where inflation was rising, leading to push up in wages. Petroleum subsidy was reduced. Diesel subsidy was, which the finance minister at that point of time thought was a very smart move. We'll reduce it by 50 paisa kind of a thing. But it pinches. So your cost of cultivation went up, your profits were squeezed, and farmers were back on the street, simply because even the production was going up, your input prices were rising faster than your output prices.
But by 2014-15, oil prices had started coming down. In fact, in 2015, they fell quite sharply. Did that not help matters?
It improved the fortunes of the government. I mean, the government made a killing because even the prices came by 1/3, the market prices of petroleum did not go down because the government raised the taxes to recover money from the population. Now, but remember, when the petroleum prices went down, prices of most of the agricultural commodities also went down. So in 2014 August, when the petroleum prices collapsed, prices of most of commercial crops also collapsed. And there is a link between those ones, because commercial crops are more or less follow the trend of petroleum prices or primary commodities, in that sense, the metals and other commodities. And we had a spate of suicides on the farmers who are traders who are dealing with guar and other mentha and other commodities which are traded internationally in the market. But input prices did not go down. So there was a situation where output prices collapsed faster, your input prices did not go down. So as we are back again to the situation, because not a single amount of penny that was taken by the government as part of the increased taxes in petroleum prices was shifted back to farmers. On the other hand, if you look at the period from 2014 to 2018, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 up to 18, investment in agriculture was in real terms declining. So not just the government was not supporting, but in a sense the measure of support to agriculture sector was coming down. And that is where I think the problem started with. And 14, 15, for some reason, I mean, which is what is very common in Indian agriculture, were also a year of double drought. And that again further wreaked havoc on farmers' profitability, because whether government policy, the rising prices, all of these declining output prices. So farmers were really not getting a breather in the respite, what you call as there's not even a breathing space.
But 2016 was a good year. I mean, after 2 drought years, 2016 was a good year.
So 2016 is when finally the weather came back to normal. Prices had started looking up. Prices had stabilized by then. And the economy was also bouncing back at that point of time. We reached in fact, the highest GDP growth was also during that 2016-17 period is the year. So there was an upward swing going from what we had, the taper tantrum and economy collapsing to recovery. So 16-17 was the peak in the decade of, in fact, 2010 to 2020, that decade, that was the year when the GDP was the highest. But then demonetization happened in November, right at the time when the farmers were ready with the harvest, planning to go to the market, trying to sell, and they were suddenly told that the currency is not valid. A lot of distress sell happened. Farmers could not buy input because that is also the sowing time for the Rabi crops. They could not buy input. Some of them could not sell their produce. A lot of disruption happened, and that disruption is now something which is, most of the agricultural trade is non-digitalized, it's actually cash. And so whatever little breathing space they got in 2016 was again snatched away. And so that is what basically created the problem, and it also affected the non-agricultural sector. In fact, since 2016 onwards is a story where the point that you made earlier, and the point that I think we should all understand, is that agriculture, when we talk about agriculture, we can't look at agriculture in a silo, and it's not something which is isolated and unconnected with the non-agricultural economy. It's a vital link, both directly as well as indirectly. There is a backward linkages, there is a forward linkages, and in both ways, the distinction between agriculture and non-agriculture that we used to talk about, it was more of an academic distinction in any case, that no longer exists. And there is a kind of continuum that we are talking about, where it is difficult to distinguish between where agriculture ends and where non-agriculture begins, or where non-agriculture ends and where agriculture begins. So we are in a continuum that is there.
Can we take a step back, Professor Himanshu, and can you also explain what was happening to the non-farm economy? What is its significance, and how was that? What was the interplay there?
Actually, if you look at the term itself, when we say non-farm, and that's something which is the debate that came from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is anything which is not farm. So it starts from as a residual category, because agriculture was a dominant one, where 70–80% of the population was working. The GDP was close to 50% in the first 2 decades. And so in a sense, non-agriculture was treated as what we call as the residual part of it. Anything that is not agriculture is non-agriculture, that's a strict. But non-agriculture is actually a very dynamic and a vital sector in the sense. It includes manufacturing, construction, services, all sorts of sectors are included in that. But today, after particularly in the last decade or so, we are in a situation where agriculture is now less than 15%. So it's the 85% of the Indian economy is the non-agricultural sector. But it is the sector which is now not just driven by what is happening to the urban areas, but also it is very important in the rural areas. And its contribution is roughly 50% there. Employment share now has gone up to more than 50%. But the non-agriculture sector acts as a sponge, which is basically that agriculture will continue to have fluctuations because of weather. I mean, you can't, I mean, there is going to be a drought, there is going to be a flood, there is going to be excess rain, timely rain, untimely rain, all sorts of things are going to happen. The non-agriculture sector acts as a sponge. It basically expands to create any slack that is created by the agriculture sector when there is a crisis. And it shrinks to allow agriculture to expand whenever. So it's a very important, what we call as a safety valve, what you use it. And the movement from agriculture to non-agriculture in that sense is a seamless one. I mean, there is no entry barrier. So somebody who is an agricultural laborer is also a non-agricultural laborer. Some season they are working here, there's some season. And today we have a situation where if you look at the secondary data, you will come to a situation where there is hardly, like less than 5% population, which is only dependent on agriculture. Rest of the rural population are basically now earning income from both agriculture as well as non-agriculture, and that is something. Now, so normally what will happen is that, which is what happened in 2014, 15 or 9 or other earlier period when we have a drought, is that the non-agricultural sector will provide that cushion. But in 2016-17, the demonetization not only hurt the agricultural sector, it also hurt the non-agriculture sector badly. And within 6–7 months of the non-agricultural, we had the GST rollout, which literally paralyzed the non-agricultural sector because of what happened, the way it was rolled out. It created so the non-agriculture sector, instead of being playing a supporting role, was itself under crisis. And that is why you see from 8.2% rate of growth which we had in 2016, within 2 years we were down to less than half of that, which is around 4% in 2019-20, which is the year before the COVID pandemic. And much of the disruption was in the rural areas. So here is where the non-agriculture sector, which was supposed to be basically kind of protecting the agriculture sector, itself was looking at support from the agriculture sector. So leaving the agriculture sector to fend for itself. That is what aggravated the crisis, and you can see that happening in 2017, the prices coming down, the Mandsaur firing happening, the long march happening in Maharashtra, farmers going on protest in Rajasthan, the Tamil Nadu farmers sitting here for 100 days. It became like and not a single state was there which was not protesting. 2018 when the UP farmers blocked Delhi, you remember, I mean, that more than 50,000 farmers came in tractors. And So every section of the farming, I mean, and that is, I think, which is distinguishes the last 5 years from the previous such episodes, is that earlier the crisis, obviously it was man-made, it was policy-induced, was more or less localized. Like cotton farming was affecting only certain parts of the country. Or for example, the crisis that happened in soybean or in other parts. In the last 4 or 5 years, you have come to a situation where each and every state of the country, farmers are up in arms, are in distress, because it is no longer a crop specific, it is no longer state specific, and it is no longer affecting only a certain class of farmers. So it is not small and marginal farmers alone, it is not the large farmers alone, it is not the commercial crops alone, it is not the food crops alone, it is now going beyond that and now kind of becoming more and more widespread. And that, I think, is really the worrying part of the situation, because if it was localized, you could have taken care of it, but it is now becoming more and more widespread.
Now, it's very important, you've mentioned, you've written about this elsewhere also, that the last 5 years, the farmer distress has actually intensified. So the origins might be more long term, but in the last 5 years, things have actually got worse. Are there any data points that we can look at, that you look at, which would suggest that this is happening? You know, a lot of people would want to know what is the data supporting this.
I mean, I think for me, this has always been the 3 variables that I look at for the agricultural sector. One is what is happening to agricultural wages, casual worker wages, and non-agricultural wages also. I mean, more or less they mirror each other. And if you look at it from 2014 onwards, agricultural wages have been continuously under decline. This is the longest period, 7-8 year period, when the agricultural wages on a long stretch, 8 years, when they have been declined. They have declined for 1 year, 2 years, when they were drought or something like that. Some catastrophe has happened and those kind of things. But a sustained period of around 7-8 years, this is the first time since 1960 that we have data on agricultural wages, non-agricultural wages. Which basically means that roughly 1/3 of the population of this country, which is casual manual laborer, hasn't seen an improvement in income. In fact, has seen a real decline in income. And that affects the consumption demand, simply because they are the ones who also consumed. And since at the bottom of the distribution, the demand is skewed in favor of agricultural commodities. So roughly 60 to 70% of the demand of the people at the bottom end of the distribution is for agricultural commodities. And if their real incomes are going down, you certainly will have an impact on demand for agricultural commodities. I mean, obviously you have this way out, that if your export demand is massively increasing, then you can, but you can't do it for 8 years. That's a long period of time. That's the number 1 variable that I always look at it. The second variable, which again is a very, very important variable, is what we call as the terms of trade, in a sense, the relative prices of agricultural commodities versus the non-agricultural commodities, which is the inputs, in a sense. Now that is something which is, even today, if you look at it, the input prices, both in terms of, there are 3 major inputs that go into agriculture. One is obviously labor cost, which is agriculture, I mean wages and those kind of things. The second is what we call as the energy cost for irrigation. That's where your diesel, electricity prices, all those things. And then finally it comes to seeds, fertilizer, and those kind of. Now both, at least in terms of energy cost, has gone up. I mean, in the last 1 year, 1.5 years, diesel prices have gone up, electricity prices have doubled. I mean, the effective electricity prices that the farmers are paying has doubled. Fertilizer prices have gone up again massively, and there is massive shortage of fertilizers. Seed prices have remained high at that level. Only the wages have not gone up to that extent, but at least overall, if you look at it, but the output prices have declined. I mean, if you look at the wholesale prices of for agricultural commodities were downward in 2019, 20, 21 including. Some episode months they have been up, but otherwise overall long-term period. So in a sense, we are in a situation where your input prices are rising faster than your output prices, and that leads to a squeeze in profits of the farmers. So that, I think, is a second important variable that you should be looking at overall in that sense. And third is the overall demand in the economy, in the sense growth, in a sense. Last 5 years, very clearly, from 8.2 to we came down to 4%, and because that also depends your not only demand for 4%, and then again we had COVID when there is a contraction of around 8%, and then we don't know what is going to happen this year. So in a sense, the non-agricultural channel, which could have pulled up demand from agricultural sector, is also down. I mean, so there is no safety mechanism, safety valve, which is there to take care of. Yeah. So in a sense, all the three are pointing out to, and that is why your agriculture sector is unlikely to recover. I mean, unless there is some kind of a effective effort to put forward a plan of action to increase their incomes.
Thank you, Professor Himanshu. So, as you heard, Professor Himanshu detailed a lot of issues that have been plaguing India's farmer distress, and quite apart from the fact that India's agriculture continues to have have record production every passing year, there is an issue of remuneration for the farmers. And as he was detailing, the data that he has given suggests that this farm distress is here to stay until unless there is a genuine, viable policy solution to it, one that farmers are willing to participate in. Thanks for watching today's episode, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.